Hi, we continue in 2 Samuel 15 today as the text shifts from Absalom's perspective to David's perspective. As the conspiracy has grown in strength and David suddenly decides it's time for him to get up and leave. But is this really a sudden let up and get up and leave, or is David playing the long con that is allowing Absalom to carry this out so that Absalom can die and Solomon, David's choice for successor, can be made the new king? We'll have to decide that as we go. So you can see on the right side of the screen as I've been going over these elements of the story from 2 Samuel 15 to 18 in the introductory video, I want to highlight just a couple of elements again that are key for what we're going to look at here. So I won't go over all these stylistic elements, although we'll see the infinitive absolute quite a number of times in our scene today. And as we continue in chapter 15, quite a number of times when one of the other elements of style is a key word that's highlighted in a particular couple of verses, repeated several times. So we'll see more of that as we go. But key today is the interpretive options, and I've been going over these for each of these videos because it's really important that we have all of them in mind as we try to figure out what is going on here and what the authors of the story are trying to get us to conclude about Absalom and David and monarchy in general. So the normal, most common way to interpret the story is through Nathan's word in 2 Samuel 12:11, which is given to come directly from Yahweh, that all this is happening because of what David did with Uriah, as we see it here. The rebellion, like the death of Amnon, is Yahweh's punishment. But one of the challenges that I've been making to that view is that thousands of people die in the war that's about to unfold. And is that part of what Yahweh is doing to punish David, allowing thousands of other innocent people to be killed? If Yahweh was so upset about the innocent death of Uriah, why would Yahweh respond to that with the innocent death of thousands more Israelites? So that seems unlikely, but it's there to lead us to believe that, so we won't consider two other possibilities at least. Another one from a secular perspective, and I want to offer the secular perspective because David is never shown throughout this entire story to consult Yahweh, and neither is Absalom. So it really is a secular story. It doesn't mean they're not calling upon Yahweh in the sense of naming Yahweh, but we can do that in our world and think how often people mention the word God, whether that's just in passing speech without actually referring to God. So we can't really know how much of that's going on here too. So from that perspective, has David just gone slack and forgotten his role and missed everything, and Absalom's taken advantage of the absence of justice and security and is taking that path? But that also seems unlikely because David has been so alert throughout, and he avoided Saul, and he was able to perform for the Philistines, so they thought he was mad. So we know David can be a performer. And I'd like to suggest that what's going on here is he's allowed Tamar to be raped, Amnon to be killed, and he's allowed the long process of Absalom building up this rebellion so that he can defeat Absalom without it looking like his responsibility. And yet I'm claiming that we can see that if we look carefully, because I'm going to suggest it's the only interpretation of the entire story that makes sense of all that's happening. So you'll have to keep that in mind as we go. Today, as we look at the shape, we're moving from the red focus on Absalom to the purple focus on David, and we see that those will alternate until they meet together in the battle as we see. So one of the things we need to look at for this unit here is this section that we're beginning to look at now forms this nice chiasm that you can see here, and you see the top part and the bottom part are framed by somebody went to David to say something. David is told in a passive here, and David is told in a passive here. And then we see in the second part, they come out on foot and leave the house, and here they're going back to Jerusalem. Zadok and Abiathar are carrying the ark back to Jerusalem, and David is going up the Mount of Olives. In the C part, he talks to Ittai, and in the C prime, he talks to Zadok, and in the center is this stately leaving by repeating the words passing through each time. And we notice how in the Absalom scene we saw here, David is only referred to as king, but framing the chiasm, someone went to David in the narrator's voice, and again in the narrator's voice down here. We'll see it's David again in the final scene because he's no longer the king at that point. And so we see that happening in our scene right here. And one of the elements we need to be paying attention to as we shift from Absalom's perspective to David's is the range of characters. So we saw last time Ahithophel, who had been David's counselor, the Gilonite, and has now gone over to Absalom. And we're going to see this long range of people. We'll see these right here in our opening scene. And what we know from these is Absalom takes on his side all Israel. And we'll see it many times as all the tribes of Israel. We saw that last time, highlighting their ancestral formation before it was a monarchy, so organized by local tribes, even though the tribes are not named. David, on the other hand, has a crew of miscellaneous people, most of them foreigners. And the Cherethites and Pelethites, as we'll see today, are mercenaries, and the Gittites and many others. So he's not representing Judah. He's representing people with personal loyalty to him, either because they're getting paid, as we assume the Cherethites and the Pelethites are, and they'll also serve Solomon, his son, later, or because they're just personally loyal to David, as we'll see next video with Ittai, who claims that. So it's not about patriotism. It's not about defending Judah. It's not even about defending Jerusalem. It's simply about defending David. So one of the things I didn't note last time, I ran out of time in an otherwise long video, was the mention of the tribes of Israel we saw last time. So we saw it in this verse here, secret messages, although we saw last time it was translated as spies, throughout all the tribes of Israel. And I just want to highlight that the Shevet tribe found 190 times in the Masoretic text, but the 12 tribes, as the phrase is only found 4 times in the Hebrew Scriptures. But tribes of Israel, without 12 tribes, is 47 times, distributed as follows. And so you see, it's not very many times in these passages, and that's been my suggestion in my book, Come Out My People, that the tribal identification was a reaction against Solomon's dividing the land up into 12 tax districts. But we'll have to get to that when we get to the Solomon story. So we've seen the references to tribes a number of times, and that's all the tribes of Israel. Of course, there are no tribes of Judah. Judah, amongst the list of tribes of Israel, is a tribe itself, but in this context, it's a separate nation. David became king over Israel in Hebron, and then over over Judah in Hebron, and then over Israel in Judah, in Jerusalem. So that's just going back to finish something we saw last time. So let's just jump right into our passage. And you'll see on the right a number of ways that I've translated more literally from the Hebrew. The New RSV really does not do a very good job here and is very misleading in a number of ways. One of the things I didn't highlight because there aren't key words so much, but the body parts. You can see came out on foot here and gone by foot, 3 feet in that section. But there's also faces and eyes and hands. And for whatever reason, New RSV covers over the bodily language, but I think that's important here to highlight that these are human beings who have hands and feet and eyes and use those in their process of living life. And so let's pay attention to the translations on the right side, and I'll point them out as we go. So on the note below is the chiasm you see laid out here from Fackelman. So it's not a messenger. Someone went to David saying, literally, the singular heart, and if we follow it on the right side, the heart of the man Israel. And I noted last time, or the first time, that I highlighted man when it's used because this is largely a male story. It's about war, and that's the providence of men, as well as politics in this patriarchal culture. But it's interesting that there's several times where Israel is referred to as a singular man. So in this case, the heart of the man Israel has gone after Absalom. David said not to his officials, which is incredibly misleading. The word often translated officials as sar or sarim, and we see that in stories like the Joseph story and the sarim of Egypt. But this is slaves, and I really want to highlight that because these are slaves. These are not hired people who are doing a job like the Secretary of Defense. These are David's slaves, and so they necessarily rely on him. Fleckman below notes several references to Israel here as tribes in contrast with David followers, highlighting the point that I just made. And it notes those slaves who were with him at Jerusalem. But what about the rest of Judah? If we look at the map, as we've been doing, here's Jerusalem, here's Hebron, where Absalom is gone while this scene is unfolding here. Here's Gilo that Ahithophel's from. And yet, what about all these places that David is allegedly king over this whole area here, including over Israel in the north? And yet the people with him are simply those at Jerusalem. Highlighting on our keywords again, I wanted to note this has get up, but I want to highlight stand, because he has stand up and flee, and then Absalom stood, we saw earlier, and that's taking a stand. So Absalom stood up here and David stands up here. It's not just get up like they were all lying down. It's time to take a stand. And I really want to suggest that David leaps into action here, and although he's posing, I'd suggest, as someone who's besieged by Absalom, I don't think he has any doubt throughout this whole story that he's the experienced warrior, that Joab knows what he's doing, and that David will remain king and Absalom will be dead. So it's not 2 separate phrases, get up, let us flee. It's stand up and flee, as we'll see, as David fled from Saul back in 1 Samuel 19, etc., as you can see down below. Or there'll be no escape for us from Absalom. Notice how the moment the messenger comes, that the heart of the man Israel is going after Absalom, David has an entire plan in mind here. This is a long statement for David, who had almost nothing to say to Absalom. When Absalom asked in the last scene whether the king would give him permission to go back to Geshur to pay his vow, he simply said, "Bashalom, go in peace." So no escape for us from Absalom. Notice the us repeated here. Let us flee. No escape for us. Will overtake us, bring disaster down upon us, meaning him and his slaves, the people right there. So hurry here is one of the many infinitive absolutes doubled, but it's got another word inside it, as you can see down here. Hurry, go, lest go. And lest is an unusual word to put in there in English. But it acknowledges some sort of hesitation here, and whether we put it in this phrase or not, there it is. Whether it's or lest he will overtake us, hurry, go, lest he will go. But the hurry is doubled about. The go is doubled here. I'm sorry, the hurry is doubled here. Or he will soon overtake us, only here in 2 Samuel. We saw it a couple times in 1 Samuel. And bring disaster, or literally thrust evil on us, as I translated over here. And attack the city with the edge of the sword. A phrase that was recalled in 1 Samuel 15:8 around Saul. And so at one level, that could suggest David is in the position of Saul, but it's really not, as we'll see. So they respond here. And as Polza notes, the synchronic slow motion effect of all the imperfects employed in these verses, note he's commenting on 15 to 37, the rest of the chapter, combined with the repetitive choreography of David's procession and with a series of meetings to turn the narrative into an account of a choreographic withdrawal rather than a hurried flight. And I think it's a really important insight because the doubling of verbs and the repeating of things, including the passing on, passing through, highlights much more of a sense of a procession than a chaotic race. So the king's slaves said to the king, "Your slaves," notice it's the same word in both places, and it's really misleading in the translation there. So the king's slaves said, "Your slaves are ready to do," which is not in the Hebrew, which ends the verse on Hinna, "Behold your slaves." And so we see that here. The king's slaves said to the king, "All that you choose, our lord the king, behold, we are your slaves." Notice how different that is than the translation here on the left side. So the king left, followed by his household, is more properly translated. So the king came out on foot and all his house. Followed, there's no verb in there for followed. So that's where you have it here, came out on foot and all his house with him. And then we have this strange thing, except 10 concubines according to New RSV, but literally 10 concubine women, which is a very unusual phrase here. The only biblical parallels in the singular in Judges 19:1-27, the horrible story of the rape there, which we noted when we looked at 2 Samuel 13, had many parallels with the rape of Tamar. Concubine, or pilgashim, which I like to translate, thanks to feminist scholars and others, as secondary women rather than the pejorative sounding concubine, but I left it as concubines here. Bodner considers David's motives, perhaps as an expression of his intent to return, perhaps to see what Absalom will do, perhaps to lure Absalom into a public act that justifies war, which is to say that Absalom will be tempted by his own advisors to, quote-unquote, go into David's concubines as an expression of his intent to be the king, to go into the king's women on the roof. And so is David leaving them there to dangle before Absalom, trusting that he would do that, and that would show how underhanded he was and how disloyal he was, and take away public sympathy when Absalom's dead? But David's motives can't be discerned directly, and that's one of the functions of the literary style of gaps, as we've seen. So we accept 10 concubine women who left behind to look after the house, which is just an interesting thing. What do they need to look after to protect it? Are they going to protect it if Absalom's army comes and takes the palace? It's not clear what intention would be there other than to station them there. So continuing into verse 17 here, and notice the repetitions in verse 16 and 17, whether in the translation here, so the king left followed by his household, the king left followed by all the people, or we see it here, so the king came out on foot and all his house, the king came out and all the people on foot. Highlighting the procession. It's an interesting thing. It's doubled not in verbs within one sentence, but the whole statement doubled. Here it was followed, his house goes with him. Here it's all the people, and again omitting on foot. This is all the people. This is not all the men. So apart from the concubine women, there are other women allowed. What about his wives? We've heard of his many wives. Are they here? But we hear nothing about them. And they stopped, as most scholars suggest, not at the last house, but at a proper noun called the far house, which is what I've translated as here. Came out and stopped at the far house, which would be understood as the last house leaving Jerusalem there. And then we get to verse 18, and we hear something that we shouldn't be too surprised about, but it's still interesting that it's noting here. As the NRSV misses the synecdoche here, as Landy shows, all his servants were passing by his hand, and all the Cherethites and the Pelethites and all the Gathites, 600 men who came at this foot from Gath, passed by the face of the king. That's the literal way of doing it, and notice he has hands and feet in there, and I translated it partly that way, but I put it this way: who had gone by foot with him from Gath, passed on before the king's face. And so let's look at that more closely. The first instance of passed on here is the Hebrew word, ever there, meaning to cross over. And one of the great ironies in this is David and his men, with Absalom following, will cross over the Jordan to the other side where the battle will take place. So not only leaving Jerusalem, but leaving the entire land of promise in a reverse exodus here. And if we didn't know the outcome and we weren't expecting that David was going to succeed in getting it back, this would be a real moment of historical tragedy for them as the king takes the people out across into the land of Transjordan. So they go with all the Cherethites and the Pelethites, and we saw them earlier. Let's look at an 8:18, which is the only earlier place, because that reveals that in that description, Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, was over the Cherethites and Pelethites, which is, say, the mercenary army, and David's sons were priests. We don't hear about them here. We'll hear about Abiathar and Zadok as priests, whatever happened to David's sons as priests, and which ones. But we don't hear about Benaiah here. Where's Benaiah amidst this great procession? The mercenaries seem to just be going on their own, and as my note below shows, they'll side with Solomon later, so they'll continue their contract, so to speak. But who's leading them? They just seem to be going with David. As Graham Auld notes, it is entirely plausible that Pelti, spelled Pelethite, was simply an alternative spelling of Pelshi for Philistine. Could it be suggested here that he's hired Philistines as mercenaries? That would really be something, going back to the people he'd worked for, who then rejected him because they thought he would be disloyal to them. The idea that he's hired them as mercenaries really goes against much of the story, and of course his own journey began with killing the Philistine Goliath. But that's certainly a possibility. So Cherethites and Pelethites and all the 600 Gittites, and notice as a list of characters, all these foreigners. Who are these 600 Gittites who had followed him from Gath? We don't know that. We have no idea who they are. And notice, still it's not following. Never once is there a verb for following here. It says here, all the 600 men who had gone by foot with him. All of these are people who had gone by foot, leaving out that for each time that these are walking by foot. From Gath, which is a Philistine city, and that's part of Ald's sense that perhaps these were Philistines because Gath was a city that David had been involved in, and the home of Goliath and King Achish, who he'd worked for. We'll see it again in the Solomon story there in 1 Kings 2:39 and 40. And they all passed on literally before the king's face. But what does that mean? If he's going and now they're going in front of him, what is that telling us? Notice that we saw earlier in the scene here that they're leaving Jerusalem and they leave going by the people. So actually, we'll see that here. The slaves here are passing by him, and yet they're all passing before the king's face here, as if he's going behind them. And so we really don't know the sequence of the procession, but it would make sense that they're going first to protect the body of the king, and that will come out later in their strategy when he decides he wants to go into the battle against Absalom, and they treat this like it's a chess game. They're the pawns, he's the king, he needs to stay protected, and they need to go into the battle. So that sets up our scene here, and we'll see as we move into the next part of the chiasm next time, the conversation with Ittai that's parallel later with the conversation with Hushai the Archite about people who claim their loyalty to David, and yet he tries to send them back before they insist on staying with him out of personal loyalty to David the king. That's where we'll pick it up next time. See you then. Bye-bye.